Hello and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about my process and how I think about and work with Lorcana cards within the system that I'm kind of working on in terms of using Lorcana as a way to support self-exploration and personal growth, in addition to kind of thinking about it on its own, which is what the focus on this video is today. I'm also working on ways to integrate like Lorcana and little elements within the game, or just having like game elements in general, in using tarot cards, oracle cards, and other types of tools, including charms. But today I pulled as like just a random daily pull the Maleficent card. And so today I'm going to walk through how I think about working with all of the information that is on this card. So first of all, Maleficent is amethyst color. And if I, refer to what I kind of set up as each different color within the Lorcana cards kind of represent or orient towards, amethyst orients towards essentially insight and intuition, pattern recognition, creativity, dreams, and inner wisdom. So that's kind of just like a general starting point. Okay, so it kind of lets me know that's kind of the area that I might be thinking about this card. And like, let's step back for an even bigger like view and perspective here. So what is the point of this? Well, it's because at any given time, there is so much that has our attention that we're focusing on. And so when we're using cards in this way, it can function to illuminate or highlight or bring forth kind of something that we weren't necessarily expecting or hadn't considered. It can give us a different perspective or a different way to think about something in our lives. So with all that said, and just kind of a little bit of mirroring that inner process with this card, if we look here, it has these different, and I think of these as different types of like archetypes or character identities that Maleficent holds, right? So she is a floodborn, a villain, a queen, and a sorcerer, right? She holds multiple different identities. And similarly, we all hold multiple different identities and different types of inner roles, and we have different parts of ourselves. So to kind of get started and move forward with how I'm thinking about this card, there's 4 identities. So I am really into using dice. So I'm going to go ahead and roll a die, a D4, and it's going to indicate kind of which lens I'm going to be working through with the rest of my whole process here. And I rolled a 1. So that is Floodborn. So this is kind of like the archetypal lens that I'm going to be thinking through a lot of what the rest of my interpretation is. And so a Floodborn is about like transformation, emergence, altered states of self, kind of thinking about a part of me that is in transition, something like emerging, evolving. And so kind of it's this theme of being transformed, right? So that is my first kind of stop. And I'm to keep this video not super long and not too getting off topic and getting all these different types of pathways, I'm not going to go into how I might think about like if it was a sorcerer or the queen, for example. But basically, thinking that, Maleficent as this formidable queen, right? That's kind of what she is, a formidable queen in the sense of being like this like transformative force, right? That's kind of how I'm starting to think about this card. So right off the bat, I'm starting to think along the lines of like stepping into something, some kind of power, right? Some kind of personal power, maybe a part of myself that is like potent or intimidating or really kind of strong. And also kind of, going back to that intuition place is kind of thinking along the lines of thinking about honoring and, really honoring my own intuition and really trusting in that in a not necessarily non-questioning, but from a place of strength. And so again, these are just kind of like my thoughts, just kind of off the top of my head. And the power of this type of work is that you might have completely different associations, completely different things might come to mind when you're starting to think within this type of container that's starting to form. So now I'm thinking about the ink cost, which is 8, right? And so the ink cost is kind of like that level of emotional engagement, right? Where did I have that written down? It represents like the effort or emotional energy required. So because this is an 8, that's relatively high. That's kind of more about like engaging really deeply and like going back to that kind of intuition and really tuning into myself in like a really deep way. Kind of something, doing things in a more meaningful and engaged way, kind of within that overall context of transformation. Now, I also want to say, these are great moments and opportunities to pop in other tarot cards or oracle cards to kind of explore things in more expansive ways. But again, I just want to keep coming back to working with like the specifics of a card and the specific elements and how we can think about things like the cost of ink and strength and willpower and, all these different pieces of the card in a deeper and personally in tuned way. Okay. So now moving on to the strength and the willpower. So these are also both really high. So strength of 7 indicates that actions can be taken, having like a really strong behavioral capacity, right? So again, this is a very strong archetype. There's a lot of strength here. And then the willpower also being 7, remember willpower is about capacity to sit with discomfort. This is really, also kind of sitting with complexity, particularly if we think about transformation, being in the liminal space, which can be really uncomfortable. And so it's kind of like there is like the ability to act, and the emotional like tolerance and emotional capacity, right? And so again, I'm not going to go too into detail, but you can really kind of sit with this and think about what this means, like personally, what area of life this might be highlighting, right? So like, what is an area in my life where there's a lot of emotion around, and it might not be something that I'm like immediately thinking of top of mind in my day-to-day, but it's still there. It might be in the background. And this card is actually like calling it forth and allowing me to work with it and think about it maybe in a way that I hadn't thought of or been considering before. So now moving on to lore. So this has 2 lore, and lore function in a certain way, of course, in the game. But in this approach, in this method of working with Lorcana, lore kind of gives an indication of how many like distinct insights or guiding principles the card is offering. So because it has 2, there are dual lessons. There's 2 perspectives. There's 2 kind of main takeaways that this card is offering. So for me, like the way that I'm thinking about it, one is on kind of like going back to the idea of claiming my inner authority, tuning more into my own intuition, my own inner wisdom, my own like inner source of power, right? And so again, that comes from the idea that she's a formidable queen, right? Even if we're not specifically thinking about the queen archetype, it's still kind of part of her like character, right? And then the second lore, so I kind of read a little bit about this blurb and I'm gonna get into it, but essentially, spoiler version, the second lore piece comes from kind of being this idea of returning a chosen opposing character, item, or location to their player's hand, right? So like, what does that mean? This is, okay, so let me back up. So the lore is like the dual lesson, right? So there's 2. There's one about kind of stepping into my own power. And the second one is kind of like being really specific and clear and even like boundaried and assertive in terms of clearing small obstacles. So now thinking about like the abilities and the action text on this card. So it's a shift 6, right? So you can play it on top of one of your other characters of Maleficent. To me, this is more about kind of like evolving, stepping into an identity that builds on an existing one, right? Like we're coming back to that kind of more inner focus, that more like evolving and transformational space, right? And kind of like, again, the core idea of building on what already exists instead of like starting from zero. So, you know, other ways to think about it are like evolving a pattern, improving a habit, deepening a boundary, refining, you know, an existing intention, revising an ongoing process, something that's more internal and intuitive, right? Again, kind of going back to those key themes of Amethyst, which is like insight and intuition and pattern recognition, and really inner wisdom, right? So then there's this other action here about, you know, returning chosen opposing character, item, or location with a cost of 3 to their hand. So this is, you know, 3 is like a relatively low number, right? So these are kind of like small distractions and energy drains, things that are kind of like getting in the way of listening to myself, little obstacles, things that are kind of like minor but super irritating, like low level annoyances, sending them back to where they came from, clearing the path, tiny like energy leaks, background frustrations, little things that are tolerated but are actually like super draining. So if I even wanted to distill that further into like something actionable, like, okay, identify one small thing draining my energy and like remove it. So like don't negotiate with it, right? Like kind of step into that power of Maleficent, this like very formidable queen, being transformative and really kind of, you know, just almost like banishing it, right? And again, if we're thinking about like a specific area that's really emotionally charged, right? That's the area, right? Like, is it a small thing that's, you know, with work or my personal life or, you know, whatever it is, kind of again, well, what's some like a really big, heavy, like emotional area? What has a lot of emotional, like, charge to it in some way, right? That's kind of what these numbers are like really kind of indicating. Is it like setting a boundary and being super assertive and that's super difficult? Well, this card is saying you can do it and you can tolerate it, right? So this card is kind of like an invitation, right? Of stop minimizing like my own inner strength, removing things that are distracting or draining, making shifts that build on something that is already existing, and stepping into a more like intuitive and innerly grounded version of myself. And so then if I wanted to journal further on this, essentially I could think about a small habit or pattern or identity that wants to evolve. So that's just one way, or a way that I think about when I am working with a card from Lorcana, particularly a character card in this case, in a way that it is much more personally relevant. And like I said, this could work very well with pulling other tarot and oracle and charms around the card to kind of explore it and flesh it out further. But essentially, you know, for me, I'm tuning into like what's the color, the ink cost, the willpower, and the strength, how many like kind of key guiding principles or insights, the archetype or like the lens. And then I'm kind of being very metaphorical in terms of how I'm interpreting the actions on the card, right? So shift to you know, it's basically like evolving a version of Maleficent that already exists, right? Well, evolving a version of myself that already exists. Kind of returning these small cost items, these small energy drains to where they came from, right? And so kind of thinking about how that might parallel into my own life. So that's my process. I will be doing definitely more videos on using Lorcana, and then of course evolving it into using Lorcana with tarot and oracle, always for self-exploration and personal growth, never for prediction. You are never ever required to find meaning when there is none. There is autonomy and power in that discernment. If you like this video, please go ahead and subscribe, and I will see you next time.